like the shooter in Sydney might be a little easier. Yeah.
It's not as straightforward. You can't do it for a weekend. Sydney's getting fun. It's a much more logistically challenging exercise to get to the other side. I thought I'd speak about followers at the university. I got a little bit of answers. Don't know how much people know about this.
No.
I guess you're also in that approach.
No. There's Judy taking her clandestine shots at me.
There's not much that's clandestine about Judy. In your face.
Yeah, sure. The COVID.
We'll give it a couple.
I think a few minutes. There might have been another thing on somewhere else that's finishing almost now when people are stopping food or something on the way here. There will be some of those. There's always some. For whatever reason they attend it and they're too tired to cross. Something stupid happens or a meeting overruns. Things that happen. Anyway, a few more minutes later.
Yes. At the school Yes. Yeah, I nearly made a mistake. Should we make a start?
Yeah, they don't look like they're 4 a.m.
Well, no, but also they can sneak it
Yeah.
up the back there. We might make a start. Colleagues, visitors, friends, my name is Chris Dixon. I'm the Director of Research and Research Training in the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to our public lecture to be presented by Professor Richard Hutch. As you might have noticed, Australians have recently commemorated an event of some consequence in our national history. Without diminishing the significance of that moment in Australian memory, it's important to note that 2015 marks other equally significant historical anniversaries. 50 years ago, in August 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act. Building on the achievements of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act provided the legislative framework for the enfranchisement of millions of hitherto disenfranchised African Americans. Notwithstanding the ongoing discrimination endured by black Americans 5 decades later, the Voting Rights Act was a landmark in America's troubled history of race relations. In many ways, there is a direct connection between Lyndon Johnson's legislative achievements during the mid-1960s and the election of Barack Obama in 2008. Rightly, we acknowledge Johnson's accomplishments. Few anticipated that a white Southern president would have such political nerve. And we appreciate too the contribution of civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. The dream he articulated so eloquently on that hot Washington day in 1963 transcended time and place and continues to inspire subsequent generations of reformers, both in the United States and elsewhere. But there is another dimension to the civil rights movement that is often neglected. The achievements of men such as Johnson and King were built on the contributions of thousands of largely unknown men and women who laboured, just as their abolitionist forebears had a century earlier, to overcome American inequality. Appalled by the searing racism that persisted south of the Mason-Dixon line, these men and women worked to bridge the gap between the rhetoric of American democracy and the realities of American racism. And let's be clear about this. The South was not giving up without a fight. As Governor George Wallace of Alabama put it in 1963, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. The following year, 3 civil rights workers were murdered in neighbouring Mississippi. These were, as Phil Oakes put it, the days of decision. One of those who made a decision was today's speaker. In 1965, as the United States went to war in Vietnam, and as it was fighting, or refighting, a different civil war closer to home, Richard Hutch, a 19-year-old college student, volunteered to go south to Alabama. Richard spent that summer working on the voter registration drive, helping organise and mobilise African Americans who lived daily under a regime that seemed somehow stuck in time. So how did Richard come to be in Alabama in mid-1965? Richard probably won't mind me saying that he was in many ways no different from most of his peers. A working-class kid from New Jersey, and this proves that the ill-named Garden State has given us more than just Bruce Springsteen and Tony Soprano. In 1965, Richard was a student at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. Gettysburg was in many ways an unlikely breeding ground for a radical commitment to racial reform. It was, after all, a long way from the excitement of Berkeley or the tumult of Columbia University. But perhaps, in another way, Gettysburg was somehow instrumental to Richard's political motivation and sense of moral urgency. Gettysburg College is situated adjacent to the most famous battlefield of the American Civil War, where Robert E. Lee, seeking to invade the Union and thereby turn Northern opinion against the war, was defeated in July 1863. It was to Gettysburg, too, that President Abraham Lincoln travelled that November to deliver a speech that is no less famous, if rather more brief, than that delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. a century later. In connecting the battlefield sacrifices at Gettysburg and elsewhere to a higher cause, Lincoln spoke for all generations. Yet when the Civil War ended 18 months later, in 1865, yes, 2015 marks another historical anniversary, the struggle was not over. For while Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse, the White South did not surrender. Not really. The demise of the Confederacy and the abolition of slavery left many questions unanswered. 100 years later, our speaker today played his part in answering those questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Hutch as he describes his experiences of marching to the courthouse, the life of a volunteer in the American Civil Rights Movement in the Deep South, 1965.
Thanks for that informative introduction, Chris. Bang on. Now, as Martin Luther King said in 1963 in Washington at the start of his very famous speech, and I quote, "I am happy to join with you today in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness." And later in his speech, he defined that further as meaning the riches of liberty and the security of justice. That's what we're on about. That's what I'm still on about. And I'd like to tell you how I was on about that in 1965. Now, during a rainy afternoon in my biology laboratory class in Glatfelter Hall, during my first year at Gettysburg College, news arrived that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, shot, and killed in Dallas, Texas. It was November 2nd, 1963. Now, the college arranged a bus. A number of us boarded the bus and were driven on Sunday to Washington, D.C., where we stood on Pennsylvania Avenue and watched the president's cortege move his flag-draped casket from the White House to the Capitol, where over 250,000 people filed by to pay their respects. Now, the president was laid to rest in Arlington Cemetery the next day. There was not a dry eye in the crowd. And thus it all began for me. From a comfortable and peaceful life at Gettysburg College, I and several others would be drawn into a vortex of unprecedented national historical events. That power and its exercise could be assumed to work on behalf of all citizens would never again be taken for granted. Goodness was struck down. Caprice and injustice were now exposed as the violent underbelly of national life. Some students started to change the conversation on campus, albeit in small circles of like-minded people. We shifted what we usually talked about from everyday local college life, fraternities, sororities, and studies, to how what we were studying and seeing with outrage on daily news reports could be applied to change American national life. We did not actually realize it then, but we unwittingly became social justice activists together. You'll note on my left some props. I brought props from the time. That's the shirt I wore several times each week during the summer of '65. My mother would be proud because it's laundered. It has the original campaign buttons on it, and below it is the sign, register and vote, redeem Southern politics. We would put these up, nail them to trees, fence posts, the fronts of general stores, wherever we could. And in effect, it was a way to mobilize the community. Any community mobilization needs two things. It needs a message, and the message is on the poster, and it needs a symbol of that message. And the shirt and those buttons are the symbols. When you saw us coming, you knew what we stood for. In early 1976, 2 years into my first academic position as an assistant professor of religious studies at Southern Illinois University, I received a short note from the Reverend John Van Arsdale, the chaplain of the college, until 1976 when he became chaplain of Yale University. "Dear Dick," he said, I quote, "the chapel council has just sent $136 to the Manuel Bayou Hospital in Mississippi, which served so many freedom marchers in the 1960s. In part, we wanted to remember Gettysburg students who worked on voter registration in the South. You were one. Warm greetings to you. I'd welcome news of your life. Cordially, John Van Arsdale," unquote. During the rest of my freshman or first year at Gettysburg, 1963 through 64, and for the most of the sophomore year, 64-5, the chapel council, would you believe, served as the beacon of light where social commitment and budding activism could be developed amongst a small group of people who watched national events unfold on television after Kennedy's assassination. In particular, the most disturbing events which we witnessed daily occurred during 1964, when the civil rights movement approached a feverish and violent pitch in the Deep South. During the summer of 1964, 3 civil rights movement workers participating in the Freedom Summer campaign to register Southern blacks to vote, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodwin, were shot at close range and killed in June by members of the Mississippi White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. The nation reeled with outrage, but their deaths assisted in the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A similar dynamic came into play when 1965 rolled around, focusing on getting a reticent Congress and president to pass the voting rights bill that year. Few of us knew of the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson on February 26, 1965 in Selma, Alabama. Some Southern news never reached broadcasters in the North back then, especially news about the killing of black men. However, as we were drawn into 1965, the meaning of this man's murder became clear indeed. A call to rally a nation to justice, beginning in Selma soon afterward. Now, the Human Relations Forum at Gettysburg College, which was aligned with the Chapel Council, formulated a plan. As Forum President Tom Heston wrote to all students at the college, quote, "At this time, members of the Forum are endeavoring to raise money to support Gettysburg College students in a voter registration drive in the South. We're working in conjunction with SCOPE, the Summer Community Organization and Political Education Project of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the biracial group affiliated with the Martin Luther King movement. A detailed copy of this project is enclosed. Please study it carefully," unquote. Now, the Forum held a meeting on Wednesday, May 19th, in the Student Union building. This followed the Selma to Montgomery, Alabama march, which itself was triggered by the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson a month before. Beginning with an attempt to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge as police violence ensued on March 7th. So-called Bloody Sunday. Now, the march on to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, eventually succeeded on March 25th. After 2 days of violence and fear, the march now placed under the direct control of the president. This voter registration march to the state courthouse became a model for the basic operation of the SCOPE project. I believe that recruiters from the SCLC attended the forum to explain things to the gathering. Unfamiliar black faces appeared on campus that day. There were so few ordinarily. Then and there I decided I must go south. My conscience permitted no other choice. Selma was a shocking national event. It played constantly on my mind. This may never have happened had not national news coverage by CBS, the New York Times, and other news outlets been there to report what they witnessed as marchers were violently beaten off the Edmund Pettus Bridge and driven back into town by state troopers, including a horse-mounted posse of Ku Klux Klan members and supporters, led by the sheriff of Dallas County, Jim Clark. Edmund Pettus, by the way, was a Confederate general during the Civil War. No longer was the South only a black problem. It was also a national scourge, now recognized as such across the nation. Walking back to my room that night after the forum meeting, I wondered how to tell my plans to my fraternity brothers at the teak house, Tau Cap Epsilon, Bula Bula Bula, who had no clue whatsoever that anything like this was brewing in the life of one of their fraternity brothers. Moreover, how to break the news to my parents, working-class people from the Newark, New Jersey area. Anyway, several nights later, while walking alone through the battlefield south of town, as was my occasional habit during my college years, stars twinkling overhead, images associated to form a configuration before my mind's eye. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, with a loss of 50,000 lives there in 3 days, accounting for the dead, wounded, and missing. The high water mark of the Confederate push into the north, the push southward by the Northern troops and final Union victory, and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address delivered at Cemetery Ridge on the battlefield in November 1863, followed by Lincoln's own assassination in April 1865. Then, 100 years ago, such associations conspired in my mind and heart, my soul. It became my soul force. That configuration of meaning lifted my decision to go south, not only to a new existential realization of who I was now becoming, but also from the backwater of easy campus life into contemporary national history. Before me stretched the incomplete trajectory of justice, initiated by Abraham Lincoln, and more importantly now, a moral, even spiritual duty to bring to completion all that yet needed to be done. That moment of insight felt like fate pulling me forward. There was no turning back, those who reasoned with me to do otherwise notwithstanding. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Such a Negro spiritual could be readily contextualized, and in my case, it might go something like this. No, George Wallace. No, George Wallace. No more Wallace over me, over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Or not. Our activism was hardly otherworldly, but soon very practically this worldly, to say the least. Such was the call to the movement, the whole quality of our active commitment together, which was greater than the sum of the parts, its volunteers. The movement became everything. An ephemeral reality in our midst focused all decision-making and actions by civil rights workers who were now about to participate in the SCOPE project during the summer of '65. We would work on a plane of awareness of what was at stake that was beyond the simple, though arduous, politics and economics of self-interest. We did this in spite of the potential for violence just below the surface of things. Violence that could rise up and strike us at any time that summer. I suppose it helped, being only 19 years old, feeling a certain sense that a long future was still ahead of me. It was on a Sunday afternoon, June 13th, when my parents drove me to a small town south of Gettysburg, where I joined several others at the home of a Mennonite minister, the Reverend Klassen, who was to drive us all to Atlanta in his Volkswagen bus. We drove all night through unfamiliar territory where eateries, toilets, motels were marked white or colored, but never both together or not at all. Being colorblind was thwarted at every turn. This is one of the handbills we would hand out. And here's another. From memory, albeit perhaps dim now, aboard the bus from Gettysburg College were myself, Scott Chambers, Bob Friedman, and David Hoon. Nobody knows what happened to those three blokes. I'm the last man standing. We arrived in Atlanta the next morning and looked forward to a week or so, June 14th through 19th, of orientation with Scope officials from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, chief of whom was the project director, Hosea Williams, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference leader who drew the short straw and thereby was the first to lead the Selma to Montgomery March only several months earlier. The executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was Bayard Rustin, a wise elder and historian of the movement. Everyone looked up to this bearded civil rights sage. Because we arrived late in the afternoon of the first day of the Scope orientation, we missed some sessions, including the following talks. History of the SCLC by Ralph Abernathy, Vice President and Treasurer of the SCLC. Why We Are Here by Hosea Williams, and The Civil Rights Movement Since 1954 by Bayard Rustin. We did, however, check in just in time to hear our first address of the week at 7 p.m. that evening. Why We Are Here, by none other than Martin Luther King, Jr., a stellar start to all that would come in the days and weeks ahead. We were plunged into Southern Black society, first by checking into dorm rooms at Morris Brown and Clark colleges, small and then so-called all-Negro colleges located in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. I was assigned to Pfeiffer Hall, Clark College, where I also took meals. I still have my ticket book for meals as a souvenir. This is the envelope in which our orientation materials came. You can see those meanies in center stage. They need reform. And my meal ticket, and some instructions for registration. Archival items, to say the least. A simple operating manual. What you need to do as a Scope person. Get an office. Obtain local workers, and organize transportation. We didn't have computers. Everything was handwritten, and usually the local people were very happy to make these kinds of publications for our use, which we mimeographed by hand in the back of what would become our office. As I had never significantly known black people before, here they were all around. We were sharing rooms, toilets, and bathing facilities with them daily, while being trained in the gymnasium of the colleges just a stroll down the avenue in Atlanta. One thing that sticks in my mind was the smell of the communal bathroom area. The ever-present fecal smell ensured that time there was as short as possible. The temptation was to associate this as a persistent feature of living with blacks. But I got with the spirit of what was happening and thought that the janitors were slack, not enough disinfectant was used, and so forth. Being caught in racial stereotyping based on my northern white world, where my mother thought all blacks smelled bad and often said so when I was growing up, especially on our shopping trips to downtown Newark, New Jersey, was a constant challenge to overcome. Meals were tops during orientation, with lots of pork chops, fried chicken, black-eyed peas, greens, and cornbread. Losing weight was not an option. During registration, a scope registration form had to be completed, including personal details. Have you ever had your physical examination? Huh? No. If so, do you have your medical questionnaire with you, completed and signed by your physician? Huh? No. In which case, I was advised that a date and place for a physical examination would be arranged, but this never happened. The schedule of presenters during orientation was relentless, but always fascinating, including hands-on sessions about how to organize communities for political action and what to do if you encountered physical violence. Adopting the fetal position on the ground was a nonviolent option we were taught, but nothing was said about what to do if you were shot, which in our naivete we never thought was an option, but it was. Martin Luther King spoke on our first night in Atlanta and went on being part of the proceedings during most other evenings of orientation, often schmoozing through groups of volunteers, shaking hands and chatting informally. It was all so relaxed, like I was getting to know a man beyond the politics of racism and self-interest, kind of like a spiritual leader, the likes of whom reminded me of the Gettysburg College chaplain who had so inspired me along with others. King possessed an infectious inner quiet. He was a short man. This inner quiet was a presence that could open horizons of hope and spark visions of social justice in the hearts and minds of those who met him. I shook King's hand 3 times, and he knew me enough at the end of the week to say, "Thank you for what you're doing, Dick." Really, needless to say, my knees weakened then and there, a personal send-off to our work in the movement from the man himself, then and there, a Father God in my eyes. Special sessions were held on such topics as how to hold a mass meeting, managing press relations, use of the Watts line of the telephone or the wide area telephone service, a precursor to the direct dial 1-800 numbers used today, contacting congressmen and local papers, the relationship of Scope volunteers to local projects field staff and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference National Office, and relations with northern groups. Scope was organized at a county level throughout the southern states. On Saturday, June 19th, volunteers were assigned their counties, where they were to work. Now, the contingent from Gettysburg College joined the group from Dickinson College. There were 4 blokes from Gettysburg, 2 blokes from Dickinson, and 2 women from Dickinson. And it was the 8 of us that teamed up and shared the experience of the summer of '65. Together we were assigned first to Wilcox County, south of Selma, but finally to Barber County, Alabama. Now you can see Dallas County kind of right up here, okay? That's where Selma is, and the Selma to Montgomery March moved from Dallas County through Lowndes County over into Montgomery County. That was the location of the capital of the state of Alabama, where the courthouse was, where people were trying to go to register to vote. Wilcox County sits south of Dallas County, but to make a long story short, the focus I'm involved in is over here in Barber County on the eastern side of Alabama. Unlike adjacent Dallas County, the location of Selma, Wilcox County finally was not considered developed sufficiently to host us. That is, the consciousness and moral courage of the local black community at that time lacked enough insight and resilience to be effective for Scope. People there were unlikely to provide what was needed on the ground: housing, office, telephone, food, and supplies, along with local black groups who were organized and prepared to pitch in to do what was planned for voter registration drives in the face of adversity by the white community. The fear factor amongst the black community of Wilcox County was judged to be greater than it was in Barber County. After driving from Atlanta to Montgomery, after orientation, we finally found Freedom House and stayed overnight there in Camden, Wilcox County, Alabama. There we learned all this about assigning us somewhere, namely that Wilcox County was out and that Barber County was where we would eventually be headed. En route, we drove through Lowndes County. Now, the Selma to Montgomery march took place mostly eastward through Lowndes County, on the way to Montgomery County, as I've said. Civil rights worker and mother of 5, Viola Liuzu, was murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan while driving through Lowndes County as the Selma to Montgomery march came to a close after dropping fellow marchers from other states off at the Montgomery airport for their journeys home. The Reverend James Reeb, a white Unitarian Universalist minister who had joined the Selma event, was murdered earlier in Dallas County, even before the first attempt to march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge took place. However, for us, there was a lot of hanging around for several days, cooling our heels in Wilcox County. Hosea Williams came by and gave us some money with which we were able to eat for a while, all while sleeping on pews and the more comfortable carpeted altar floors of the Antioch Baptist Church. The church was fired upon by locals on that night of our arrival. No injuries occurred, but for the first time our group got a good taste of the gravity of what we were doing. That evening, dinner consisted of 1/2 pound of cottage cheese and watermelon, shared between about 8 of us, as we anticipated actually getting down to registering voters and not just sitting around waiting for things to happen or to be killed. A bomb threat made to the church that day meant that we shifted temporarily into the Masonic Hall behind the church, doing so while a pickup truck roared by and whites shot shotguns at us with pellets ripping into the boards of the front door of the church. I heard the cracking of the boards over my head as I dived into bushes on the side of the church steps. The cuff of my jeans got ripped by a pellet or two as I sought protection in the bushes. Had the shooters stopped and sought us out, who knows what would have happened. Scary. On June 24th, our occasional SCLC minder, the Reverend Harold, said we were finally being assigned to Henry County and adjacent Barber County, where we would finally be able to get down to work without waiting idly by and wondering when we could get started. As it turned out, we never got to Henry County, but the decision was made for us to focus specifically on Barber County, the home county of the governor of Alabama, George Wallace. Did I say scary? Well, the prospect was now very scary, as Wallace was the poster boy for white racism in the South. Reverend Harrell arranged for us to meet Mr. Kelly, a black carpenter and president of the local NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Our base in Barber County on the Chattahoochee River, which separates southeast Alabama and southwest Georgia. Now, Mr. Kelly showed us our meeting room and office, which had been arranged by the NAACP, the Eufaula Baptist Academy, amidst the black neighborhood in town, the focus of our planning, our work, and sharing meals together, and dealing with ever-present cockroaches. This is the Eufaula Baptist Academy in the background, and up until 1963, it was a school for youngsters, but by the time we got there, was a vacant building. Reverend Harold gave us a portable gas camping stove to cook on, which served us extremely well for the entire summer once we learned how to light it without blowing ourselves up. We all slept there for the next several nights until local blacks could overcome their anxiety and fear and provide us with accommodation in walking distance from the Baptist Academy. We went to the Kelly's house for breakfast the next morning after our first night in town and enjoyed a most unusual meal, the likes of which I had never in my life faced. Pork brains mixed in scrambled eggs with grits. No doubt about it, I was in the deep South, and our times indeed were a-changin'. We got into soul food unwittingly, well before soul food became trendy in the 1970s. So we had finally arrived and could embark on what we volunteered to do, namely, register as many black, often illiterate people in Barber County, and try to stay safe whilst doing so. Singing freedom songs in the evening on the first few days there helped to steady nerves and attract local youths to the Baptist Academy, whom we hope would become voter registration volunteers to help us. Our orientation a short while ago in Atlanta saw us ending each day with lessons in singing songs of freedom and underscoring the powerful hope that we shall overcome one day. The closing anthem sung at the end of all civil rights movement meetings throughout the South. This we repeated nightly in Barber County, sitting on the steps of the Baptist Academy during the summer of '65. Our daily work. First, a little about Eufaula and what we faced. Welcome to historic Eufaula, Alabama, big bass capital of the world. And there's a picture of a big bass. There's an aerial view of Eufaula. You can see the Chattahoochee River separating Alabama on the right and Georgia on the left. We would occasionally go swimming in there, but recent news in the papers from Eufaula, Alabama indicate that freshwater crocodiles have often been sighted in the Chattahoochee River, so you wouldn't want to swim there these days. Here's a traditional southern home. That was on the other side of the tracks from where we lived. Many of the homes in Eufaula looked a lot like that. And the people who lived in them remembered the old ways. And always, in every small southern town, there is a statue commemorating the Confederacy. Remember, our job was to bring about community organization and teach lessons in political education, the SCOPE mantra. Now, I want to offer a couple of vignettes of our daily work, or how we went about carrying out a summer-long voter registration drive, when the chance of great success was less than likely, unless the U.S. Congress and the President, Lyndon Johnson, eventually came on board soon, no longer stalling in passing a proposed voting rights bill within the year. SCOPE was not a militant group like CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, two groups that invited local, social, mostly racial confrontation for bringing about political change. Organization and education were non-confrontational, intentionally nonviolent ways to address what was happening in the South. Such was King's message to us: confront physical force with soul force. Such tactical differences would become increasingly attractive to us, especially after a trip to Bogalusa, Louisiana, in order to join confrontational marches there sponsored by CORE, which we diplomatically avoided telling our SCLC minder. At any rate, here are some vignettes of what our daily efforts looked like. First was the institution of the mass meeting, the big meeting. We made our presence known throughout the county by walking miles of dusty, sometimes muddy country roads through acre after acre of cotton fields, peppered by the rickety houses of black sharecroppers and the occasional rickety, clapboard, one-room church building. Front porches were where everything happened. You got called to sit down a spell and chat. Another local Eufaula resident who lived at the time I was there. And another contemporary on her front porch, putting on her best, looking proud. And this was often a scene one could see walking through the regions. A sharecropper with her child. And note up over the mantelpiece the high hope placed in Santa Claus. And that's where they live, in places like that. Our goal was to talk with folks, usually on their porches, for as long as it would take to urge them to be ready to get into pickup trucks, volunteered by local blacks, sympathetic to the movement, at an arranged time of a day that week. We worked the dusty roads and cotton fields, encouraging folks on their porches to join the movement and register to vote. There we are, white and black scope workers together. And again, we'll come in the morning to pick you up. People would then be driven to the courthouse in the county seat, Clayton, about 15 miles away from Eufaula, where we would go with them up the courthouse steps to attempt to register to vote. Now, this process was helped by giving out handbills to those who could read them, announcing that the night before going to Clayton, a mass meeting would be held in their local church in the middle of some cotton field somewhere. This was just like what was done at Brown Chapel in Selma to energize the march there earlier in the year, that infamous March in March, 1965. Most people were always keen to attend church and even to learn the freedom songs we sang in lieu of hymns. One of us would mount the podium and welcome the assembly. Hallelujah! We call on Jesus to set us free. Hallelujah. I come from Martin Luther King, that messenger of God, to bring you the good news of freedom. The good news of freedom. Martin Luther King is like Moses, who led his people out of bondage in Egypt and into the promised land. Hallelujah. Hallelujah, brothers. And that's what's happening now. That's what's happening now. Tomorrow we will drive by your homes to pick you up, and you be there. Okay, Moses will walk by and pick you up. We will set out for the promised land of freedom that comes not when we die by and by, but now, when we register to vote. Be prepared to go tomorrow, brothers and sisters. We will go together every inch of the way. Amen. Little by little, mass meetings worked out, beginning with the young and then some oldsters. Here is a proud woman. Her feet is tired, but her soul soars. A national bohemian in a class of her own, perhaps. Of course, fear was rife and ever present. As one old woman put it while tending her cauldron of laundry, boiling clothes whiter than white, in her front yard, by her porch, a fire that was fired by offcuts of pine, she said to me, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, you see these feet, they tired feet. They don't walk no good no more. I feel good just sitting right here. Yes, sir. Ours, however, was a subtle siege mentality at work. Gradually, the canvassing and mass meetings worked well to increase voter registration in Barber County. It may not seem a great accomplishment, but by July 6th, after working the county for only 12 days since our arrival in Eufaula, 250 people were transported to the Clayton Courthouse, one-third of whom were illiterate and hence declared by the state of Alabama to be ineligible to register to vote by the county registrar. We were cheered to know that our efforts were paying off, albeit slowly, in a trickle. 20 black citizens out of that group of 250 successfully registered to vote. Most of them even signed prepared forms declaring the unconstitutionality of the vague and tricky Part 3 of the registration form, in which potential voters had to be literate and then answer questions like, who was the first Chinese president of the United States? Name all the county registrars in the state of Alabama. And one Barack Obama is keen to always cite, and I quote him, "Tell me now, how many bubbles are on a bar of soap?" Of course, the answers were usually declared wrong. Many folks just drew a blank, so no registration succeeded in such cases. On one occasion at the courthouse, George Wallace himself, surrounded by his fellow rednecks and crackers, as we called them, white as saltines, watched our proceedings with obvious scowls and derision. On the following day, July 7, we counted 16 new registrations out of 98 people processed. 160 people showed up at the Clayton Courthouse on that day. As folks often put it, to reddish to vote. I'm going to reddish to vote. Another vignette involves local logistics, living there amongst the community we were working with. Mike from Dickinson College owned our only vehicle, a clapped-out vintage Valiant that was in the habit of blowing tires. I and a local worker once drove it on muddy roads amidst the cotton fields while making contact with people in Baker Hill, about 20 miles from Eufaula. The car slipped off the muddy corrugated road and slid into a gully. Now, a couple of white boys in a tractor drove past, laughing at us, giving us the finger. We walked then 3 miles in the rain to find some black people who had an ancient tractor, cranked it very hard for about 15 minutes until it started, and then drove to our car and pulled it out of the muddy ditch. On the way back to Eufaula, we got a flat tire and then the car overheated. So it went. Now, besides Mike's well-worn vehicle, we were mostly relying on the goodwill and transportation volunteered by locals. That night, we sat around hamburgers for dinner and sang freedom songs by candlelight until it was time to call it a day. Larry from Dickinson College and I shared a double bed with a crude bathtub in the room in a small house owned by a widow, a Mrs. Corbin. Now, the house was adjacent to a sawmill. The mill started up at 6 a.m. each morning with a screeching and rasping of sawing, which, of course, woke us before we were ready to get out of bed. We rarely saw Mrs. Corbin. Her fear factor was considerably high. But one day a note appeared on our door asking us not to return to our room before 11 p.m. that night. It appears that the modest rent Mrs. Corbin received from the Scope project was hardly what she could get if she occasionally rented out the room to couples with obvious intentions on a short-term hourly basis. On those few afternoons and nights during the summer, Larry and I would arrive home late and exhausted, only to find the bed was unmade. Mrs. Corbin usually pulled the bed covers up after we left her house each morning. So we slept on towels on the bare mattress on such nights. Evidently, our scope women in the project fared better where they lodged, though I recall one of them once wrinkling her lily-white nose and saying that the drains in the bathroom where she stayed always smelled of urine. It should be mentioned that black girls played up to us white boys on almost a daily basis. They would often arrive at the Baptist Academy with cakes, lemon meringue pies, and even vodka, usually dressed well and keen to invite us to local Saturday night dances in juke joints. The song by The Temptations, My Girl, was #1 song in 1965. Talking about my girl, brum, bum, 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 bum. Don't be embarrassed. Now, sexual opportunities were rife, but the stoicism of being in the movement curtailed taking them up for most of us. I myself was still trying to figure out what a sexual opportunity was, not yet being affected by the sexual revolution to come. Several years ago, happenstance struck when one girl I was quite sweet on at the end of my time in the South sought me out on Facebook. We have enjoyed being in touch ever since, though the worlds we inhabit now are very different from the one we shared closely in Alabama. Now, on July 10th, while driving home from visiting people in Barber County, out in the boondocks, we heard on the car radio a call put out by James Farmer, director of the Congress for Racial Equality, urging all core chapters to participate in marching and picketing in Bogalusa, Louisiana for the next week or so. The Crown Zellerbach Paper Company, the largest employer in Bogalusa, was the main target. The company provided 70% of the town's income, with 40% of the town's population employed there. However, blacks were only menial workers. None filled supervisory positions, which CORE sought. And although we were not a CORE chapter, the prospect of doing more on behalf of freedom and justice for all in the broader civil rights movement impelled us to plan then and there to get into our car and journey south at 4 a.m. the following day, a Sunday. Now, we were facing some kind of conflict. Scope frowned on so-called politics of confrontation, for which CORE and, of course, SNCC were very well known. By contrast, those of us doing the daily slog and the somewhat sedate Scope effort in Alabama came alive at the prospect of entering into the to and fro and hurly-burly of political confrontation in the streets of Bogalusa, Louisiana. Thus, we played our journey south for a week, close to the chest, not informing our Scope minders what we were about to do. Getting into the, quote, real action, unquote, so to speak, exactly how I recorded it in my journal at the time, made our adrenaline flow. Passing through Mississippi and then into Louisiana was scary. Foreign territory where intense racial bigotry was known to take sudden, violent turns against civil rights workers. Cheney, Schwerner, Goodwin. We were 2 miles outside Bogalusa when we saw state troopers on the side of the road, and we later learned that the troopers had blockaded the road, trying to keep civil rights volunteers away. But CORE lawyers secured an injunction against this, and the blockade was lifted before we arrived in town at 2 p.m. that Sunday afternoon. We then searched for Freedom House, the organizational hub of CORE there. As we crossed the bridge into town, groups of crackers were hanging around the streets, waving Confederate flags as we passed, with, of course, Pennsylvania number plates on our car. And they were shouting obscenities at us like, "Nigger lovers, outside agitators." We asked one state trooper for directions to CORE headquarters. Not necessarily a wise move, but to our surprise, he told us, albeit reluctantly. He held his shotgun, however, on his hip while directing traffic and giving us directions to this Corps headquarters. Our other troopers carried submachine guns and little red cans of what we supposed contained tear gas. The entire social environment elevated the tension in the air, quite in contrast to what we were used to up north in the relatively harmonious back blocks that was most of Barber County, Alabama. In Barber County, confrontational politics remain marginal to our efforts so far, and these efforts based on community organization and political education. However, our tactics related to change a bit after we thought about the lessons we learned in Bogalusa and how they might be applied to our SCOPE project back in Alabama. No time was wasted getting into demonstrations in Bogalusa. Late in the afternoon of the day of our arrival, we formed ranks of 6 across, with girls in the middle and guys on the outsides of columns of marchers. We all held hands as our demonstration started moving from in front of the Labor Hall, Freedom House, and sang freedom songs nonstop all the way. There were approximately 400 of us, with James Farmer leading the way down the main street. As we were moving out, about 375 state troopers, according to an official local radio report, lined up around the marchers, presumably for their protection from angry townsfolk, standing on sidewalks along the route of the march. And if you look closely at the column, this one, there's one white lad in the column. That, I believe, is yours truly. Now, the troopers carried pistols and clubs. Some troopers took our pictures with pocket cameras, which we could only imagine was the Ku Klux Klan, getting white civil rights workers clearly in their sights, perhaps to target us for violence later. Tears of fear and sorrow came to my eyes. Why must people march for freedom, I asked myself. Am I actually walking through the valley of the shadow of death, where I should fear no evil? Evil obviously was ever present. Being beaten to death on the spot was an unshakable thought on my mind during the march. I was very, very scared. This march was a major test of my commitment to the movement, a personal and fearful emotional low ebb indeed. However, to persevere was the only option as the march moved forward, come what may, all moving together. I was called white trash, white nigger, and bleached when I fell in the Mississippi River. Taunts by white people jeering from the sidewalks along the streets of our marches. Tear gas could be smelled. Small children of the angry onlookers also imitated their parents and jeered at us with a venom of racial bigotry. Summertime recreational activity, perhaps, for the local white children. Such marches went on for several days. A number of us also engaged in picketing small businesses in town that either did not hire black workers or, if they did, treated them unfairly as far as pay and conditions went. In general, picketing was a tactic to limit the amount of money plowed into the local economy by the workers at Crown Zellerbach. I picketed stores in the main street. First, Rosenblum's department store in the morning, and then the Western Auto Parts store in the afternoon. Trash, trash, I was repeatedly called, even by small white children, as I walked back and forth with my sign. Don't buy, walk by. Don't buy, walk by. Now, a white boy about my age sauntered slowly towards me, and bam, punched me hard with his right fist in my left jaw just below my ear. My assailant fled into the auto parts store and joined some of his friends looking out through the window of the shop Watching me stunned in the learned fetal position, I squirmed on the ground, holding my head and expecting more beating at any moment. About 5 state troopers watched, of course, and I asked them, when I could stand up and stagger around, to report the attack. They smiled, and I was told that they did not see the kid who hit me, which I knew to be untrue. He was standing in the auto parts store looking out at me with his friends. Nonetheless, my zeal to pick myself up and resume picketing increased by such a violent confrontation. We shall not fear and be afraid. Marches continued during the week, though tension escalated as we noticed that the state troopers who lined our ranks for our so-called protection now all carried submachine guns, the butts of which were balanced on their hips and pointed directly at the heads of the male marchers on the outsides of the column. Again, very scary. At one mass meeting, we heard author Louis Lomax, author of Negro Revolt, speak. He announced that all bond money that might be required if marchers got arrested and jailed would be provided by an organization in California, which also donated $15,000 to the Bogalusa Voters League. Our zeal to continue marching soared to a high pitch on the crest of this good news. 2 years later, after the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, voters in Louisiana went to the courthouse at the state capital of Baton Rouge, but as you can see, protection from federal troops was still needed as they marched back to Bogalusa from that courthouse to register to vote in Baton Rouge. On the first night in Bogalusa, we were given the address of Mrs. McGee, the woman who was assigned to put all of us up in her house for our sojourn in town. Now, there was a most unusual encounter that took place. Namely, we met black men who were members of what was called in Bogalusa the Deacons for Defense and Justice. The Deacons were organized to protect civil rights workers during demonstrations. At least 2 deacons were assigned to the houses where white workers were billeted, where the deacons would sit on porches or lurk in backyards in shadows throughout the night, armed with small caliber pistols and rifles, committed to doing what might need to be done if whites attempted to do us harm or damage Mrs. McGee's house with firebombs. A television movie about the men in Bogalusa called Deacons for Defense was published in 2003. Before retiring for the night, we went to a mass meeting where we were addressed by James Farmer and sang freedom songs with what was called the Freedom Choir, which was filmed by NBC News, probably to show white civil rights workers from the North helping blacks be free in the South. The air of courage amongst the black community that was galvanized by the core demonstrations always stopped me by my tracks in Bogalusa. It was palpable. Mrs. McGee told us that night that the deacons feel as though, quote, they take full responsibility, unquote, for our safety. When we left Bogalusa very early in the morning on Wednesday, the 14th of July, the Deacons for Defense and Justice escorted our car, front and behind, out of town. Our 4 a.m. departure was necessary because these fathers, as Mrs. McGee called them, could only escort us in the early hours of the morning, as they had to go to work after staying up all night protecting us in support of the movement. We could only marvel at their hard-won inner resilience and commitment to looking after us and thereby furthering the cause of the movement. Late that afternoon, we arrived back in Eufaula, feeling deeply affected by all we experienced in Louisiana. During our Bogalusa sojourn, 2 of our original co-workers from Dickinson and Gettysburg College remained behind in Eufaula. Unbeknownst to us, they held a mass meeting while we were away, to which the local mayor was invited. He spoke about things he wanted to give the black community by way of integration, To our astonishment, we learned that the mayor received a standing ovation. I and another worker booked an appointment with the mayor, which took place on Thursday afternoon. Our purpose was to clarify what he was going to do about local integration, or pin him down about the kinds of hopes he stirred in the assembly at the mass meeting and how, specifically, he planned to fulfill those hopes for the black community. However, when we met, he said nothing significant about integration, only that we, quote, couldn't be trusted and have caused resentment about town, unquote. No instances or examples were offered about this. So we walked out of the mayor's office feeling new militancy in regard to confronting what we now call the power structure of Barber County. Being in the big bass capital of the world was one thing, but achieving freedom for all appeared to be quite another matter for officials at Town Hall, an unpalatable one at that. Volunteers gathered together to plot new initiatives. Waiting was no longer an option. Community organization and political education make for one thing, and these activities, of course, would continue. But staging political confrontation was indeed a tactic that started to make new sense to all of us. Much was learned in Bogalusa. Our group discussed such new insights. It was decided that if approval from our scope minder, the Reverend Harold, for staging small demonstrations throughout the county was not forthcoming, then we could well pick up stakes, go to Jackson, Mississippi, and join SNCC. Nonetheless, our thought was now to develop local black leaders and voters' leagues, just as we had experienced in Bogalusa, doing so by means of creating tension situations between whites and blacks in Barber County, just short, of course, from encouraging the formation of a local group of Deacons for Defense and Justice as backup. The hope was that local leaders would emerge out of such events. That night, I cooked fantastic fried chicken for everybody on our camp stove back in our office at the Baptist Academy. We found strength and increased purpose in our new, more militant stance and resolve. We probably drank a few beers together on the front steps of the Baptist Academy that night as well. During subsequent days, mass meetings were held, and the idea about establishing local voters' leagues was put to the assemblies. Changed gears from scope operating practice, with its emphasis on individual voter registrations per se. We were cheered when Reverend Harold showed up at one meeting and spoke positively about what we had in mind, this with subdued militancy all his own. Later discussions took place with him, and he encouraged us to find test cases integrating local lunch counters and possibly picketing. We were pleased to have his approval for edging into confrontational politics in Barber County. He even gave us a check for $200 to keep our vision afloat, which, however, the president of the local chapter of the NAACP, Mr. Kelly, believed was rightfully owing to his organization, mainly for initially sponsoring our scope group. He ended up disappointed. Now, the director of scope, Hosea Williams, announced on the radio, July 23rd, that he himself would sanction demonstrations by scope workers if the voting rights bill was not passed by Congress by August 1st. The next several days saw the creation of voters' leagues in both Clayton and Eufaula, with committees for voter registration, industrial relations, and a youth squad, our demonstrators. On the 27th of July, we went with local black youths to integrate the City Cafe in Clayton, which we did. It had never been done there before. Local whites vacated the cafe. The whites in our group, myself included, were served apple pie on standard plates with standard forks. But the blacks were served their pie on disposable paper plates and ate with disposable plastic spoons. Local white men stood around the town square, gathering to gape at us with angry looks as we enjoyed our pie. But we succeeded. The next day we ate more pie in the same desegregated but segregated serving manner at Walgreens in Eufaula, and thus succeeded to integrate the lunch counter there as well, without too much fuss and bother. Like that. It worked the other way around too. White police confronted us. Two similar events happened on July 29-30 involving motor vehicle issues, perhaps pretext for even greater harassment to come. One of our male co-workers was pulled over in his car for supposedly breaking the 30-day rule in regard to his Pennsylvania number plates. The local judge fined him $121.50, a lawful judgment, but our co-worker chose instead to go to jail in Clayton than to pay the fine. Our fear was that he would be beaten in jail. In another instance, one of our female co-workers, a white woman, was driving a borrowed car with Alabama number plates and found herself pulled over by the police for no apparent reason. However, when she pulled her Virginia's license to drive, our co-worker went to jail, this for no apparent lawful reason. Clearly, by this stage of the game, all of us white civil rights workers could no longer keep our heads down, but were clearly recognized by the authorities there, person for person, who began to make life difficult for us, they did. We called our Montgomery-based lawyer, Solomon C., who both got our co-workers out of jail in the next few days, thankfully unbeaten and no worse for wear. All this meant that we could not drive ourselves and were now on totally dependent for local kids and community volunteers for transport, a serious slowing down of our work throughout the county. On Wednesday, August 4th, after much stalling, Congress passed the Voting Rights Bill, which became the Voting Rights Act of 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson signed it on August 6th. Now, this was the desired outcome and legal hallmark of the voter registration drive throughout the South that year, beginning in Selma, and I'd like to think ending in Eufaula. By that act, our work in the SCOPE project finally could be considered finished. However, on the day before, Tuesday, August 3rd, and unaware that the bill would be passed by Congress the following day, I became the leader of a voter registration march from our assembly point at a local church in Clayton to the county courthouse. It was our first confrontational march, following the Bogalusa example. There were 100 of us, marching in rows of 3 and singing freedom songs. Little harassment occurred during the march. However, we noticed water sprinklers across the sidewalks leading up to the courthouse. So we went up the side approach and then lined up in front of the stairs up to the building. The county sheriff nervously emerged from the courthouse and stood on the top step. The entire police force of Clayton, albeit a mere handful of officers, remained in the lobby of the building. I acted as spokesperson, our very first demonstration in Barber County, just like the one from Selma to Montgomery. Lolita Jones and Mary Marshall, a local SCOPE volunteer and a Eufaula Voters League member respectively, stood with me. I asked the sheriff to arrange for an immediate meeting with both Circuit Court Judge Wallace, the governor's brother, and probate Judge Little. We were told that Judge Little was out of town, and Judge Wallace, whom we saw standing in the lobby of the courthouse, refused to talk to us because we arrived, said the sheriff, quoting the judge, as a mob, unquote. The sheriff was nervous, as was evident from his knees trembling through his trousers. We waited for a while, but then marched singing freedom songs back to the church where we had first assembled. I nearly got run down by a white man driving a truck who purposely veered off the road in my direction. I had to jump out of the way. Because we asked the sheriff to arrange a meeting for the following morning at 8 a.m., we vowed to march again before then to show them all that we meant business. Although the next day's morning march by about 130 demonstrators was enlivening, Judge Wallace again persisted in saying through the sheriff that he would not talk to a mob. We held mass meetings in Clayton and Eufaula that night to sustain the momentum for marching to the courthouse to register to vote yet again. However, the plan was to hire a bus to pick up a larger than ever before number of demonstrators throughout the county. That plan fell through, so our march, that third march, never took place. Shots were fired that night into several homes of black folk demonstrated in Clayton. Both there and in Eufaula, shots were heard. I rang the United Press International, UPI, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, to report both incidents. My last act as a civil rights volunteer working in the Scope project of that summer of 1965. I departed from the South early in the morning of Friday, August 6th, the same day that President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Bill into law and handed Martin Luther King Jr. the pen. A bus carried me to Columbus, Georgia, where I boarded a train that would take me to Atlanta, and then a day later, overnight, home to Newark, New Jersey, where my relieved parents received me with open arms as I walked from the local bus stop up my street and crossed the field next to our house. My father, who, unlike my mother, never really questioned or interrogated me much about why I wanted to go south, and who could relate to my commitment based on his work in his labor union, was sitting in the backyard reading the newspaper under the oak tree that he planted from an acorn many years ago. He stood up, and a broad smile came across his face as I approached. It was all the welcome home I needed. Nonetheless, that weekend, a backyard family barbecue was held to celebrate my return. No fried chicken, no black-eyed peas, no greens and no cornbread were in sight. Just the usual American hamburgers and hot dogs. But in acknowledgement of my work in the movement in the South, of course, also lots of watermelon. And then our worst fear came true 3 years later. You might say that the summer of 1965 changed my life in profound ways, as fate, and I will call it fate, pulled me further into the future, and as it continues to doing so to this day. But of course, that's another story. Thank you very much.
A couple of minutes of questions. Does anyone have any questions?
What prompted you to join Scope instead of Courthouse? What prompted you to join Scope instead of Courthouse?
Well, I think a recruiter from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference came to my college at Gettysburg specifically to push the Scope project. I wasn't too au fait with CORE and SNCC then, other than to know that their people were getting killed off and shot at. And the only approach made on my campus was by people representing Scope. So they made the easy option. In those days, the most radical place on campus was the chaplain's office. If you couldn't find anything in a fraternity or a sorority or a classroom, nothing else existed. But the radical progressive chaplain we had made sure that these Scope volunteers showed up, recruiters showed up, and gave us the pitch. And the pitch was indeed compelling, especially there at that site of Gettysburg on the battlefield that I was so enamored of.
Okay.
Richard, thanks for a fantastic presentation. When you described your own sort of configuration of meaning where you thought about the past and present and liberty and freedom. Those sorts of profoundly idealistic but also profoundly personal kind of motives. Do you think that was typical of the other volunteers you were working with, or did they come into it with different
I
aspirations?
think I was rather unique. The choice to go south to